and welcome to the Veritas Monthly Wrap-Up. This month, October, we looked at talking about your generation's mental health. This was centered around it being International Mental Health Month, which is really interesting because it's not celebrated as much here in Australia because it's coming off the back of Are You OK Day in September. But Veritas, we looked at the different ways mental health impacts and is thought of across the different generations. Why did we choose this topic? Well, as you'd all be aware, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, the last few months has been heavily impacted by COVID-19. There have been health orders in place, restrictions on movement, and we've spent a lot of time isolated and not living out the life in which we'd usually want to be engaging in. And what we've been hearing in the media is all the different ways that this has impacted the different mental health across generations. But it's sort of started to become a little bit of a competition between who'd been impacted more, which we felt was not a great way to look at it because we've all been impacted by it. It's just been in very different ways. So we thought it was a good opportunity to come together and really investigate how this has impacted our mental health across generations. Obviously, what we're saying is not the story of every single individual, and we are making broad comments that encapsulates a lot of people and doesn't specifically allow for the individual experiences we've all had. But hey, this is what we were talking about, and we wanted to sort of bring that to the forefront and disrupt some of this competitive thinking that we're having. Ultimately, at the end of the day, now and in the future, the biggest thing we can all have is empathy. We need to be empathic to ourselves and we need to be empathic to each other because all our experiences, all our opinions are going to be different. And while we're trying to come back together, we need to make space for this. And it's not about who's been impacted the most or who's the best set up moving into the future. We are one. At the end of the day, we were all in this together. And now it's time to be coming back together in the community outside of our homes. So the four generations that we looked at were baby boomers, the sandwich generation, millennials, and Gen Z. So we first looked at baby boomers, which for those of you that aren't aware, baby boomers are that generation that was born sort of directly after World War II. Baby boomers in general are the least engaged with mental health services. And that's because they grew up through that fairly common stigma around what mental health was and what it represented about the people that were battling it. From a more specific COVID example, baby boomers, it was really around a health anxiety. Yep. The baby boomers, the older generation, were, as a collective, the most vulnerable to be at serious risk of COVID-19. Their stress and anxiety mostly came from was the fact that that was a real dangerous health concern for themselves and still is. In regards to mental health as a generation and the approach, it is what it is. A lot of people in the baby boomer generation have to date lived the majority of their life in that stigmatized understanding of mental health. And we, as other generations, shouldn't be expecting that just because all of a sudden we think it's all right to talk about mental health, all of a sudden it's all right to be getting treated for mental health, that everyone's simply going to follow. But what it is with the baby boomers in supporting baby boomers and baby boomers supporting themselves, it's just trying to be as curious as possible and trying to be open to the conversation around mental health and making it okay to be vulnerable with each other. Second, we look at sandwich generation. Sandwich generation as a title or a reference is not a very common one used within explaining generations, but what it is effectively maybe what you'd refer to as a Gen X, someone who is both caring downwards, that is they've got their own children, and caring up in that they've got elderly parents or family members who they are also supporting. The sandwich generation The real challenge for themselves in COVID-19 was adapting to homeschooling, maintaining their workload and normal routine, and then caring for elderly parents or family members who might be vulnerable to the virus itself. This was really around how can you multitask as best as possible. And there's a lot of time pressure, as I said, that was placed onto this generation during the time. Really self-sacrificing in order to try and keep everyone in their family happy, healthy, and engaged. Non-COVID times, again, what we see with the sandwich generation is a lot of the mental health issues are related to stress, being time poor, and trying to juggle multiple different stressors and responsibilities at once. How do you carve out time in your day or week to look after an older parent, to get your kids to soccer practice, football practice, dance, and then also be carving out time for your own career and your own interests or achievements? So really in this generation, there is now also a change going back to being at school, the kids being at school, but then also the ongoing pressure of managing so many different people at once on top of their own. For millennials, this is for the individuals who are born, around 1985 through to 1995. This generation is actually the generation most likely to engage in mental health support. By the time this generation and this group of people that are in this age bracket, by the time we started making decisions for ourselves and beginning to really take ownership of our life, mental health had been a conversation for a long time. Mental health had started to really open up in the community and it was starting to be talked about a lot more freely. For this generation, COVID-19 loneliness was the biggest impact. This was the generation that felt most disconnected from their social networks because growing up, social media wasn't a huge influence. A lot of the relationships that millennials established were established traditionally as face-to-face and people that you were engaging with in the same room. Converting that over to social media and virtual was challenging as well. And our social relationships still were the backbone of a lot of our relationships. We weren't long-term married or had children ourselves. So that real sense of loneliness, disconnected, was the major impact. For millennials outside of COVID-19, a lot of what we see is around anxiety and within that, imposter syndrome, and then some depressive type symptoms as well. The good news, like I said at the beginning for millennials, is that as a generation, we are the most likely to engage in support as well and ask for help, which is terrific, which makes that increase in anxiety and depression less concerning. If that was on the rise, but the seek for support was on the rise, that would be a bit of an issue. And finally, we finished the month with Gen Zs. So Gen Zs are those that were usually equated to being born from 1995 onwards. The challenge for Gen Zs during COVID was it hit right in that major life-defining or changing moment around finishing school through to finishing university. So a lot of students and individuals were asked to change the way that they'd been learning during a really critical component around their Year 12 studies or their end of university studies, were asked to all of a sudden change the way that they learned and the way they knew to be taught for the last 18 to 22 years. And it wasn't so much in a time where there wasn't any pressure, there was lots of pressure. There was still an expectation to perform and still being told that this is a really important part of your life, but you're going to have to do it in this way which you've never done before. Obviously, that caused a lot of pressure and concern for Gen Zs. Day to day, Gen Zs are living and forming their identity in a time where there's never been more influence from more people at once. Social media and technology have made it so easy at the fingertip to connect with millions of people and gain the perspective of millions of people at once. And that can be really positive, but can also be really overwhelming as well. And that is where it's really important for Gen Zs to be making sure that they're always trying to digest this information and influence from that perspective of values. Am I listening to and engaging with someone that shares a similar values to what I do? Is it an appropriate expectation for me to assume my life is going to be the same as this person? And how is this information being filtered on its arrival to me? Because people aren't posting things on social media around how much today was challenging or how much they failed or how hard it's been. They're mostly posting around how much they have, a big win, an extravagant lifestyle that they may be leading. So it's always got to be a balance. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we really enjoyed talking about this topic. It was a terrific opportunity to be one, but also look at what makes us unique within the population as well. We wanted to do it as a way of not creating a competition between generations, but to explore and understand better how we have all been impacted by COVID-19 from the perspective of mental health and what our attitudes and insights and challenges are as a general rule for each generation. It's not appropriate for us to expect that we're going to be engaging with mental health collateral and information the same way, nor are we going to be asking for help or as willing to engage in support as much as each other. We've got to make space for that. And we've got to be making sure that we're practicing that empathy, that if we are concerned about someone within our generation or in a different generation, to make space and understand where they're coming from. What are some of the challenges that they might be experiencing that we have no idea about? And even though we may not feel a certain way or understand a certain challenge doesn't mean it's not real. Just because we're super open to reaching out for support when we need it doesn't mean everyone else is, nor should we expect them to be. Sometimes we need to try and talk a language of support that is impactful for the other person, not what is understandable for us. And that's the most important thing when it comes to being empathic to the challenges on a generational level as well. So that's it for today. It's been terrific talking to you once again. I look forward to talking to you at the end of November. Until then, have a terrific time and we'll see you next time. Thank you.